Chapter 28. A Bird Flying Through the Spring Sky.
"While I respect your decision, I can't help but feel disappointed,"
said Colonel Farrell, commanding officer of the Imperial Guard. Matthias listened calmly as his superior officer continued.
"One never likes to lose a capable officer. Of course, and just speaking from my perspective as a soldier, I acknowledge it would be a greater loss for the Empire as a whole if you were to continue to serve in the military, considering how much you'll be able to contribute to society as a civilian duke."
More than mere politeness, the disappointment in the colonel's eyes looked sincere. He had expected to receive a document from Captain Herhart requesting a 1-year service extension, so he was quite surprised to receive a discharge application instead. He considered trying to persuade him to reconsider, but decided this wouldn't be appropriate when he saw that he had listed his grandmother as the reason for his discharge.
"Thank you for everything, sir,"
Matthias said. As a duke, he outranked Farrell in civilian terms, but in this context military rank was all that mattered, so he used the utmost politeness when addressing him. Farrell appreciated this about Matthias, as many other aristocratic officers found it difficult to show proper deference to superior officers who were of a lower social rank than themselves. He also appreciated that Matthias had chosen a post at an overseas war front that was in particular need of help from capable officers.
"Be sure to pay me a visit whenever you're in Rats,"
he said, offering his hand to Matthias.
"Of course, sir,"
Matthias replied. He firmly shook the colonel's hand, then left his office. Stepping outside, he was greeted by the bright spring sunshine. He got into his car and was driven to downtown Rats. After meeting with a few more superior officers there, the multi-day discharge process was finally complete. Walking back towards the car, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. He had been caught off guard by the sight of someone walking down the sidewalk on the other side of the street. There was no mistaking her for anyone else. It was Layla. The chauffeur walked up to him.
"Your Grace?"
"Go back without me,"
he curtly replied, still looking across the street. It was Layla. It made no sense that she would be in Rats, but he had no doubt that it was her. He crossed the street with long strides. The museum seemed no less massive on the second visit. Looking around with just as much wonder as on the first day she had gone there, Leia took in the sight of the impressive building housing the Berg Empire's Natural History Museum. The day after they arrived in Rats, the first place Kyle had taken Layla was this museum, located across the street from each other. Rats Art Museum and Natural History Museum were among the capital city's most popular tourist destinations. Kyle was used to Layla looking like a girl headed out to a picnic. Matthias gazed at her as she excitedly walked from exhibit to exhibit without any sign of slowing down. He had already been confident that the woman he saw was Layla before she entered the Natural History Museum, but he had still decided to follow her in, keeping his distance. Even after having satisfied his curiosity about what she was doing, he wanted to keep observing her for a bit longer. Then it occurred to him that it was the time of year when the college entrance exam was being held in Rats. If she had come to the capital to take the exam, it meant that she must have made up her mind to go to college after all, which meant she had probably decided to marry Kyle Ettman as well. She was standing in front of a glass display case filled with various plant specimens, intently jotting something down in her notebook. There was an enraptured smile on her face, as if she were looking at a rare gemstone or something. Matthias had no idea what it was about the plant specimens that could possibly be making her smile like that. He considered approaching her, then decided to stand back and watch for a bit longer. Once he approached, he knew she would stop smiling. With his hands behind his back, he continued to follow her. For the most part, she seemed not to have changed much since the previous summer when he had last seen her. But there were some subtle differences. Her face looked more slender, her expression looked more relaxed, and her movements looked more graceful. Wearing a white dress with lace trim, she looked more mature as well. After spending a long time looking at everything, she left the plant specimen exhibit and started walking down the passageway to the next exhibit room. when she suddenly stopped in her tracks. Matthias knew the reason for this at once. The passageway was like heaven. It was decorated with silver-painted tree branches that had white feathers attached to them like leaves. Hanging from the branches were multicolored crystal ornaments shaped like birds. The light reflecting off them gave the passageway a dreamlike quality. She marveled at the sight.
Gosh!
Matthias heard her innocent exclamation. Watching her run excitedly around the passageway, he couldn't help but grin. Her thick blonde hair and lacy white dress fluttered as she ran about like a little girl. She then came to a stop in the middle of that wondrous passageway and, standing on her tiptoes, reached out to try to touch one of the ornaments, but the bird remained tantalizingly just beyond her fingertips as she continued to gasp in amazement with her head raised to look at the ceiling. Matthias started to walk towards her. Before she had noticed that anyone was there, he had come up behind her, put his arms around her waist, and lifted her off the ground. Startled, she turned her head to look around, but she was already floating in midair. The crystal bird that she had been unable to reach was now glittering right in front of her eyes. She felt like a bird flying through the spring sky, able to go wherever it wanted. It was a strange, beautiful, dreamlike feeling. Matthias then casually set her back down on the ground. The skirt of her dress ballooned out, then slowly descended, gently tickling her calves. The sensation of touching the crystal bird still lingered in her hands. Hiding her hands behind her back, she looked up in a daze. Matthias slowly removed his officer's cap. The same blue eyes she had seen that late summer afternoon the previous year were looking at her. Under the museum's dome was a cafe that sold snacks and beverages. The first time she visited the museum, she had eaten lunch there with Kyle. Matthias started walking in that direction. Noticing at once where he was headed, she stopped and frowned at him.
It was nice to see you, Your Grace, but I'll be on my way now.
He looked over his shoulder at her. Catching her breath, she curtsied to him and started to walk the other way.
Stop right there.
He ordered. Ignoring him, she casually walked a few more steps, but ultimately wasn't able to get away. In the blink of an eye, he had dashed past her and now stood blocking her way. She could feel passers-by looking at them.
Why are you doing this, Your Grace?
She asked, looking around in annoyance.
I hate it.
You hate what?
What you're doing. I hate it.
His nonchalance was irritating her even more.
You can't do this,
she said. Her hands started fidgeting, so she moved them to the straps of the bag she had slung over her shoulder and gripped them tightly.
So if you could please...
Would you like to do something that we shouldn't do then?
He asked, grinning. This provoked her anger even more. Frowning, she shook her head vigorously.
No.
Her hands started to tremble from the feeling of humiliation.
Absolutely not.
She felt her cheeks burning, and she knew they were bright red. In a vicious cycle, embarrassment over the fact that she was blushing made her blush even more. Meanwhile, the Duke seemed completely relaxed. He slowly looked around, taking in the surroundings, then turned his gaze back towards her.
Having made this chance encounter in the capital with you, the orphan who lives on my estate, I would simply like to buy you a cup of coffee. Is there a problem with my making such a kind gesture?
Even while insulting her like this, his tone remained polite and detached.
There's not, is there?
The smile left his face, and his eyes went cold.
Don't you agree, Layla?
He then continued walking towards the cafe. She let out a long, exasperated sigh as she watched him walk. She couldn't claim to know Duke Gerhardt well, but there was one thing about him she knew for sure, that he would use whatever means necessary to get what he wanted, and that the harder something was for him to obtain, the more he wanted it. Giving up, she trudged along behind him. Shortly after the order had been placed, the waiter brought out 2 cups of coffee. Steam rose from the cups between the 2 people, sitting in silence.
I never would have expected to run into you in a place like this, Your Grace.
Layla hesitantly began after finding the silence unbearable.
I didn't realize you were interested in natural history, so...
I'm not.
Matthias replied, cutting her off. He took a sip of his coffee.
You already know, Layla.
He continued, smirking.
I don't care about such things at all.
Then why did you?
And you must realize this isn't a coincidence either.
No.
She reflexively replied. Her body tensed up, and her heart started beating faster. She would have rather remained a lowly orphan that he pitied. She didn't want it to become anything more to him.
All I know.
Her voice had started to tremble, so she gulped before continuing.
All I know is that you hate me, Your Grace.
Suddenly, the traumatic memory of her first kiss flashed into her mind. She shut her eyes to try to rid her mind of it, but it was no use. She opened them again, and saw Matthias's blue eyes gazing at her. The memories intensified and took hold of her.
You're right. I hate you.
He calmly agreed. A wry smile formed on his face.
And now, I hate you even more deeply, Layla.
AudiosKoppo.